That's right, here are the top 5 Vanguard index funds that you can currently buy. Number 5 on this list is VDADX, otherwise known as the Vanguard Dividend Appreciation Index Fund. This index fund seeks to track the performance of the S&P US Dividend Growers Index, which is an index that measures the investment return of stocks of companies that have a record of increasing dividends over time. If you're someone who loves getting paid through dividends, this might be a perfect index fund for you. VDADX currently holds 289 different stocks, and its top holdings include many big-name dividend-paying companies, including United Healthcare Group, Microsoft, Visa, Home Depot, and more. The 10-year average return sits at around 12.48%, which means $10,000 invested 10 years ago will be worth around $32,000 today. The fund's expense ratio is very low, coming in at 0.08%, which means you would only pay $8 for every $10,000 invested. I also wanted to point out that Vanguard requires a minimum deposit for all of their index funds, and VDADX is no different, with the requirement of a $3,000 minimum investment. However, there is a solution. Vanguard offers ETF alternatives to all their index funds, so you could buy the ETF instead of the index fund. For VDADX, the ETF equivalent is VIG, or the Vanguard Appreciation ETF. This ETF is an exact replica of VDADX, but as an ETF. If you're someone who loves dividends, VDADX might be good to add to your portfolio. Number 4 on this list is VIGAX, or the Vanguard Growth Index Fund. This index fund seeks to track the performance of the CRSP US Large Cap Growth Index, which is an index that measures the investment return of large capitalization growth stocks in the US. This index fund is focused primarily on large cap growth stocks, so that means it's not very well diversified. Ideally, you would want to mix this index fund with another index fund that has holdings in mid and small cap stocks. This fund holds 260 different stocks, including companies like Apple, Amazon, Google, and so forth. Since this index fund is focused on growth, the average 10-year return of 15% makes sense, which means $10,000 invested 10 years ago would bring you around $40,000 today. The expense ratio is the lowest on this list, coming in at 0.05%, which means you would only have to pay $5 per year on a $10,000 investment. As mentioned earlier, unfortunately, this index fund also does have a minimum requirement of $3,000 invested. However, there is also an ETF version, VUG, or the Vanguard Growth ETF. Number 3 on this list is VTIAX, or the Vanguard Total International Stock Index Fund. This fund seeks to track the FTSE Global All Cap X US Index, which is an index designed to measure stock market performance around the world, excluding the United States. This fund was added to this list because, in my opinion, in the long term, it's important to have international exposure in your portfolio. This Vanguard Index Fund currently holds 7,819 international stocks, with top holdings in Nestle, Samsung, Alibaba, and Toyota. The average annual return currently sits at 5.5%, which means $10,000 invested 10 years ago would be worth around $17,000 today. I've mentioned this in a previous video, but this international index fund should not be a core position in your portfolio, simply due to the high volatility of international markets. The expense ratio for this fund sits at 0.11%, which means you would pay $11 for every $10,000 invested. Now, the ETF equivalent of this index fund is VXUS, and this does not have a minimum investment requirement. All you have to do is buy the ETF at the current share price. Number 2 on this list is VFIAX, or the Vanguard 500 Index Fund. This fund seeks to track the S&P 500 index, which is an index that tracks the performance of the 500 largest companies inside the US stock market. VFIAX is arguably one of the best buy and hold core positions in existence if you would like a fund that uses the S&P 500 as a benchmark like this fund. This index fund currently holds 503 different stocks, with top holdings in many US companies including Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Tesla, and Google. This fund currently has a 10-year average return of around 13%, so a $10,000 investment 10 years ago would bring you a value of around $36,000 today. VFIAX has one of the lowest expense ratios ever, coming in at just 0.04%, so you'll only have to pay $4 per year for every $10,000 invested. If you would like to avoid the $3,000 minimum investment requirement for this index fund, you could choose to go with the ETF alternative, which is VOO, or Vanguard's S&P 500 ETF. Many investors use this index fund as their core holding, which is the index fund that makes up a majority of someone's investment portfolio. It's crucial to have a core holding in your portfolio with consistent growth and reliable returns. Many people tend to choose an S&P 500 index fund or total stock market index fund, which brings me to number 1 on this list. Number 1 on this list is VT-SAX, or the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund. VT-SAX seeks to track the performance of the SRSP US Total Market Index, which is an index that represents virtually the entire US stock market, including large, mid, small, and micro-cap stocks. With an average 10-year return of around 13%, $10,000 invested 10 years ago would bring you around $35,000 today. Now you may be asking, why is this index fund on this list if the average returns aren't as high as some of the other index funds on this list? This is simply because this index fund gives reliable, consistent returns and is diversified across multiple sectors and market caps. For example, this fund currently holds 4,076 stocks, which is 8 times the number of stocks compared to the previous index funds, with top holdings in Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Tesla, and more. The expense ratio is also minimal, coming in at 0.04%, so you would only have to pay $4 per year on $10,000 invested. If you don't like the $3,000 minimum investment, you could always choose to buy the ETF alternative, which is VTI, or the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF. I personally buy into this ETF every single week, and I know that in the long term, I'll be able to create massive wealth through this ETF. Now, some of you may be curious about the differences between an index fund and an ETF and which one is right for you. Simply put, index funds and ETFs are almost identical. Both are types of investments that invest in a basket of stocks and bonds. Like I mentioned in this video, Vanguard offers ETF alternatives to all their index funds. The ETF equivalent, for the most part, always performs identically to the index fund. For example, if I can look up the fund profile for FVIAX, there's an option to add a fund or an ETF. This will essentially let us compare the two funds side by side to see performance against each other. So if I type in VOO, which is the ETF equivalent of VFIAX, boom, you are currently looking at two different funds compared on the same chart. We are looking at VOO, which is the ETF equivalent, and VFIAX, which is the index fund version. Now, what do we see? We see the funds have almost identical performance. We can't even see the two different lines for each fund because they match up so identically. Although these funds are almost identical, they have a few minor differences. The first major difference between an ETF and an index fund is how you invest in them. Let's say, for example, you wanted to invest in any of the Vanguard index fund mentioned in today's video. The only way you'd be able to do this is by opening up a Vanguard brokerage account. Now, technically, you could buy these Vanguard index funds at another brokerage like Fidelity, but you would end up paying over $75 per trade, which is absolutely absurd. However, ETFs are not broker specific, so you could technically buy VTI, or Vanguard's Total Stock Market ETF, on a brokerage like Fidelity. Let's also say you want to buy VTI in a Robinhood account, you could definitely do that. This is all due to the fact that ETFs trade in the stock market like a stock. Just like you could buy your favorite stock like Tesla, you could buy your favorite ETF like a stock. You can trade ETFs all day as long as the stock market is open, but with index funds, you could only trade at the end of the stock market day. Overall, you can't go wrong with any of the Vanguard index funds or ETFs on today's list. I personally hold a mixture of index funds and ETFs in my portfolios since the performance does not differ at all. That's it for today's video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new here, my name is Paul, and don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe, and hit that post notification bell for future uploads. Always remember that your life is a masterpiece, so let's unlock that full financial potential together. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.